This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, it's another interview about art and religion. This time, my guest is Richard Schusterman, and the conversation will begin in a moment. My guest is Richard Schusterman. He wrote an article some years back called Art and Religion, and I decided I wanted to speak to him about it and art and religion more in general. But as I usually like to do, I want to give my guests a little moment to tell who they are, what they do. So, welcome, Richard. If you could just spend a couple of minutes giving a little background about who you are, where you came from, and I guess an opening volley.
All right. Well, you've heard my name. I'm Richard Schusterman. I'm an academic, a philosopher by training. I did my BA and MA at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and then I did a PhD. Actually, it's called a DPhil at Oxford. I taught in Israel, but then I came to the United States. For a long time, I was professor of philosophy at Temple University and chaired the department there. And since 2005, I took the Dorothy F. Schmidt Eminent Scholar Chair in the humanities at Florida Atlantic University. But I maintain a very active international academic life. I've had visiting appointments in Berlin, Paris, Vienna, Beijing, Shanghai, Hiroshima, and Denmark. And I created in coming to FAU a Center for Body, Mind, and Culture, where our field of research is focused on somaesthetics, an area of interdisciplinary area of research that I pioneered in the late 1990s, and it's grown into a vibrant international research community. Um, it has connections to the topic of art and religion. Aesthetics is in the word soma aesthetics, and the first part of the word is the soma, which is about embodiment. And religion is something that is importantly embodied and very much connected with our embodiment and both the mortality of our embodiment and also the way our bodies partake in religion and the way religion can impact both positively and negatively our embodied experiences. So that's a sense of who I am, and I'm ready for Dan's introductory questions.
Well, before we get to that, I just wanted to talk about what you would define as art and religion. For me, I look at art as communication at its highest level, and I look at religion as communication at any level towards something higher, whether it's real or not. With art, the focus is on the communication end. For example, you could have an idea, a situation, a character, a story that's not particularly going to be new, not going to particularly be necessarily profound in what it does, but it can be well crafted or greatly crafted enough to become a great work of art. With religion, though, you can have many forms of trying to get to something transcendent, but the communication is not as important as the end goal. What do you think of those two definitions, and how do they differ from your own?
Well, actually, I think both art and religion are very much connected um, with the idea of communication. I don't have to make the point about art because you've already made it very powerfully. But religion, actually, the word comes from the Latin religere, which is to connect. And there are no individual religions. Religion always is a social thing. And although people often find the most meaningful religious moments when they're alone with themselves in meditation or in prayer, we don't have individualistic religions. Religions are always involved in a community, and they always involve communication. The prayers that you pray individually are prayers that are normally prayed together. So I think, where they are very connected is with the essence of communication. And their religions, some forms of Buddhism that are more immanent, that aren't so much concerned with communicating with a putative, supernatural, transcendent being, but more about communicating with our environment and the living world of nature and humanity that we're all part of. So I wouldn't draw the distinction so much that way. I think religions typically have a great many more rules than art does. I think religion is traditionally much more attached for most of its parts to a transcendental being and all sorts of ritual practices than art is. But art historically emerged always from religion, and I think a lot of its power is derived from its connection with religion. So I don't think there's any great artistic tradition that's devoid of some religious background, which doesn't mean that lots of works of art are produced by people who would deny that they're religious in any sense. And I've talked about that in many instances, particularly with a former mentor and very good friend of mine, the art critic Arthur Danto, who was a philosophy professor at Columbia and the art critic for The Nation magazine. And he's a complete secular Jew, so he describes himself. But his whole art theory is based on the idea of transfiguration, which is a deeply religious Christian idea. And a lot of our notions, a lot of the power of art has to do with its spiritual rewards that are not in the next world, but in this world. And when you think about the art market and how much money is spent for works of art and for the original work and not an indistinguishable copy, you get to see really that the art world is almost modeled on a religious world where you have genius artists as prophets, critics who are like the priests and interpreters, and the works of art are like priceless relics that you have to have the original in order for you to appreciate them. So I just like broadly culturally, I think the two concepts, art and religion, are very deeply intertwined. And in pre-modern cultures, the connection was deeper. So in the medieval times, most of the art was religious art that had a religious function. To a certain extent, that was true of pagan art in Greek and Roman times. And if we look into cultures like, I don't know, in India, the sculpture are very much part of the temple design. And if you take an African form of art, possession dances, so it's very difficult to decide whether that's art or a religious ritual or a medical ritual. But what's very clear about those possession dances in Africa is that they fulfill very powerfully that function that you spoke of, Dan, of communication. Because although it might be a possession dance to relieve a particular individual in the tribe of some evil demon, the way that cure is administered is in a very social context when everyone is dancing together, and it's the solidarity of the group that reaches perhaps the divine spirit that will exorcise that evil demon, or simply the power of the group that can heal the individual. So I think both are very much concerned with communication. I think art is more focused on individualism and maybe individual distinction, although there are hierarchies in religion as well.
So there was a famous evolutionary biologist named Stephen Jay Gould, and he posited that science and religion were overlapping magisteria, is what he called them, meaning different domains of the human experience. But clearly, religion spawned philosophy, which then became natural philosophy or science. Where would you place art on sort of that spectrum? Does art come more from religion? Is it, if you look at like the branching evolutionary branches, where does art place in that
Yes.
hierarchy?
So, I mean, it's a very good point you're raising in terms of genealogy and evolution. So, Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy traces Greek tragedy back to the Dionysian religions. Um, Hegel actually sees religion as supervening over art. Hegel was an idealist philosopher. He thought of the whole universe as progressing from a materialistic stage to a more and more cognitive, mental, idealist stage. He saw art as the lowest realm of that higher idealistic stage because it deals with human beings recognizing themselves as mental, cognitive, spiritual entities, and therefore knowing themselves and not just knowing the world. But art's expression of that came always in a material form. So architecture deals with matter, sculpture deals with matter. Painting is more abstract because it's two-dimensional, but it's still material. Music has sound, and the highest art for Hegel was literature or poetry because it was the most idealistic. Religion, he thought, was a superior development from art because it freed itself. Like you said, the target was no longer the making of a physical object or a linguistic object. The target was a higher level of spirituality. But for Hegel, religion was still not the highest because it depended, Hegel being a Christian, on the incarnation of God in the material form of Jesus. So, although it was reaching for a purely idealistic, non material ideal, it needed a material embodiment of that ideal, namely Jesus, to get people into that domain. What was higher than religion was philosophy, because philosophy for Hegel was clear of all that need for a focus on materiality. Now, how would Hegel translate into natural science? He would say that the cognitive dimension is on the level of philosophy, but he would push the natural scientist to go higher to a more idealistic realm. Uh, what's interesting, I mentioned Arthur Danto before, I can mention him again in this context. He actually thinks that art has gone beyond philosophy um, in the sense that philosophical discourse about the spiritual seems emptier and less powerful than artistic expressions of the spiritual. And in this, he follows a very important trend in modernity, which is the substitution of art for religion. Because, as you mentioned, with the growth and development of natural science, already since the 18th century Enlightenment, but increasingly after Darwin and evolutionary theory, the old dogmas of religion about creationism and the management of the affairs of the cosmos by a single supreme divine being, all of those quasi but false scientific facts disintegrated. And so it was very hard for people to maintain a faith in religion. So important cultural critics of the time, like Matthew Arnold, but also the French poet Mallarmé, they talked about art as replacing religion. What Matthew Arnold said is that religion, its spirituality and consolation and hope and communication is tied to putative facts rather than simply ideas, and we can no longer hold on to those facts because they've been disproved by science. Whereas poetry, the ideas, the words, the beauty are the facts. So poetry can continue to serve us. And if we generalize, art can continue to serve our spiritual needs because it doesn't depend on things that we don't believe in anymore, such as creationism and other ritualistic beliefs that today we view as vestiges of more primitive and cruel societies.
Let me. Oftentimes, you hear, as I had posited to you as a possible thing, that art has sprung from things like going from religion to philosophy, then down to science. But if you look at scientifically speaking, about 600 million years ago, when the Paleozoic age began, fish had eyes. There were eyes in the world, eyes almost similar to what humans have. Ears, hearing also evolved, even though it was underwater. So you're talking 600 million years of evolution through various animals, lines, lineages to get to human beings. And so music, which is oral, and the visual arts for the eyes have had a long time percolating within our, if you want to call, some people would call it racial memory or something like that. But language, especially written language, is maybe 6,000 years old, maybe a few thousand years more, 1/100th the age. And I've always said this is one of the reasons I think that literature is the highest form of art, because it's the most abstract. It just squiggles on a medium. But in that same vein, that kind of language became stories, and we told these stories. And one of the earliest forms of stories are religions. These fables become religions. So in a sense, one might argue that art is the father of religion.
Well, it really depends on how broadly you construe art, because I think it's certainly true that if you take art in its original Greek sense, the Greeks didn't have the word, the Greek word for art was techne, which is the word that we have now for technique, techniques, or technology. The idea of art being limited to the fine arts, that's a much later development. That didn't really gel until the 18th century. So if you think about the practical arts, the art of tool making, the art of actually early religions had a very strong aspect of idolatry. They would use idols to worship. So you could say that without sculpture, you wouldn't have objects for religion to focus on.
Mm.
So I think rather than, I mean, my approach here would be rather than taking a very strict linear line, which would get very complicated, is to speak of coevolution. And I think that's very much true for human evolution. In other words, it wasn't like we got culture after our bodies and brains were fully formed. Um, the the geological and fossil records show that the actual human brain developed over a time when culture was beginning to develop in terms of tool making and language use. So I see these things as interdependent. And actually, that's part of my view that you can't really totally extract art from religion because they're both historically very much connected and affectively connected. You don't have any art without a culture, and there hasn't been a culture without a religion in the broad sense. We can even take, Western democracy, secular Western democracy, as some very good people have argued. Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, one of them, grew out of a Christian background that was opposed to slavery. The idea that all human beings are equal and deserving of rights is something that wasn't common in Greek times. In Athenian democracy, there were slaves, and Aristotle spoke of certain people having a slavish character. So it was like natural and normal and appropriate that there would be slaves. The idea of a secular democracy where every individual has or should have equal rights comes from a background where a religious background where we're all children of God and therefore deserving of that equal rights status. So again, rather than trying to fix an order, I think it's better to see these things as evolving together. But our concept of fine art, didn't exist in Greek times, and the idea of art for art's sake was also very remote. Art was very much functional, the way religious art is functional in the Middle Ages.
Just so people know, Richard had written about 17 years ago an article or an essay called Art and Religion that he read at some was a conference in Turkey, I believe. And so a lot of this is some things that you'll be able to find in that essay, and I'll link to that below this video. One of the things that was posited within that essay was the idea of art subsuming religion. And I wanted to talk here as we record this now in the year 2024, someone looking maybe 100 or 200 years from now, hopefully, at this. I wonder what people then will think of our very materialistic in the financial, not the physicalist sense, but our very materialistic society. And, there was a term in the late 20th century called being a mall zombie. Malls now having gone the way of the dinosaur, and now maybe internet trolls, where people spend inordinate portions of their lives doing nothing of any deeper nature. And I wonder if a lot of the rise of fundamentalism, not only in faraway places like the Middle East or wherever else might be, but even here in the U.S., religious fundamentalism, I wonder if the rise of that has to do with the dearth of meaning, things that art and religion can provide.
Okay, I guess the first thing I'd like to say, Dan, is that I appreciate your optimism that there will be people around in 100 years. The way the world is now, it's it's very grim. I wrote that essay to deliver in Turkey in 2007. I think that was during or shortly after the Iraq War, but it was during all of the terrorism and civil strife and daily American casualties, not to mention local casualties, in the fighting between the Sunnis and the Shias, and that's still going on. The Middle East in some way is far away, but it impacts us very much. I mean, the war in Yemen between the Houthis and the traditional government is also a Sunni Shia um, conflict. And so, yeah, I hope people will be around in 100 years, and there won't be some nuclear conflagration or climate change, which is also, a big worry for me. But in terms of what you say with fundamentalism, yeah, I think one of the problems, and this is something that I've written a lot about, is that the art world has become so sophisticated and elitist that the function of communication that you raised early on is becoming communication for a very, very limited group of people. And so I think a lot of secular people are not finding the spiritual substance that people used to find, not only in visual art, but in theater, um, in opera. Not to mention that it's too expensive to, for most people to get opera tickets. People don't read anymore the way they used to and get spiritual substance and nourishment from that. And so I think when people are looking for meaning and they don't want to make an effort to struggle with artworks that are more difficult to understand and to appreciate than lectures or speeches or presentations, or maybe I just should say performances of charismatic evangelists. So the spiritual hunger just reaches out for anything. And so I think fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, is becomes more and more attractive to people who are looking for meaning in their lives and cannot find it in the field of art, in the field of literature, or in politics. I mean, politics is another kind of depressing phenomenon where it seems to have become just a field for professional people, professional politicians. There's very little faith in our political leaders, but they just keep on getting elected. So I think with this desire for meaning in life, people turn to fundamental religion or they turn to sports. I mean, in some way, when you're talking about art as making community or religion as making community. So, in some way, this is simplification, of course. There was a time when instead of going to church on Sunday, people would go to museums on Sunday for spiritual edification. Now I think lots of people go to sporting events. You support your local football team. There you get a sense of meaning and solidarity and community that you once got in your church or your local community political organization or the people that you enjoyed art with, a book reading club. Now people find that connectedness in sports. So I think there are all sorts of outlets that people look for. I think the art world has been a bit, I don't want to say guilty, but and I don't want to say defective, but the art world has not been able to connect very well to broad audiences, the official art world. But I think popular art, particularly popular music, has kind of filled the gap, and that's why one of my earlier books, Pragmatist Aesthetics, spent a lot of time defending the legitimacy of popular music, and that's another place where people invest their yearning for meaning.
Well, I want to pick up on that decline aspect of popular art in a moment, but I wanted to pick up on something earlier. You had mentioned about the Sunnis versus the Shias, and then you mentioned sports, and there are a lot of incidents where, especially like soccer matches, people from one side, rush against the opposing team and whatnot. At its worst, though, it seems that art is a little bit less violent than religion or even sports because you don't have bands of postmodernists launching missile strikes against abstract expressionists. Maybe you'll get a condescending review written about you, but that might be the worst of it.
That's right. I mean, that's a point I make in the article, because I think the the thrust of the article is exploration of this idea that art can be a very good substitute for religion because it gives the communication, it gives the meaning, it satisfies a sense of spiritual elevation and self improvement that we have, but it's free of the crude metaphysics, the scientifically refuted cosmology and cosmogony, and it can do everything that religion does without all the defects. But then the question is, doesn't it in some way rely on that history of culture, and don't some of its concepts, genius, creation, some of its affectivity and spirituality, doesn't it rely in some way on the religious traditions? And that's why I went back to the idea of transfiguration and the art world as a higher world, as metaphysically elevated over the real world. And so I think there's a bit of a tension there. I'm still for the art world supplanting religion, being a more attractive, less dangerous form of community. Um, but I don't think art can completely jettison its history or clean itself of the traces. And maybe, those traces aren't necessarily bad, but the idea of saying, okay, we can forget about the history, we'll just do art and we'll just ignore religion, that doesn't seem to be entirely convincing, because a lot of the concepts that we use in appreciating art and a lot of our habits and behaviors in artistic aesthetic experience are related and have that religious heritage, the kind of sense of sacredness of the gallery space or the theater space, the same reverential silence in waiting for the musicians to perform. A lot of the staging um, has a religious background. And actually, this is a case where you can go back to the etymological roots in Greek and Hebrew. of the very idea of a stage or scene, where the scene or the stage where you put on a drama. It goes back to roots in the Hebrew Bible of the tabernacle. In some way, the tabernacle was kind of like the or original theater. It was a place where God's glory or presence was supposed to enter. Of course, the Hebrew God, you're not allowed to make an image of the Hebrew God. And so his presence was always some kind of diffuse atmosphere, but it was captured in the place, the Holy Tabernacle, which the Hebrews carried around with them as they wandered through the desert before they came to Canaan, the Promised Land. And there's very, very long description in the Bible of how you build the tabernacle. So, the early Hebrew art, since you weren't allowed to make a graven image because that was idolatry, all of that artistic energy went into the ornamentation of the Torah, and before the Torah, of course, it was the ornamentation and construction of the tabernacles. So, and the same thing with Greek sculpture. It was the sculptures of gods and goddesses that were put in temples. So, just genealogically, there's a deep connection between art and religion. And the point is not that we're stuck with those ancient ideas, but we shouldn't turn our back to the traces of them in actual artistic practice and artistic theory. We just need to try to make sure that we don't carry with us the unpleasant and primitive social vestiges of some of those early religions that have, things that look incredibly ridiculous from our current perspective.
We've talked mostly about Western concepts of religion. I want to talk a little bit about some Eastern concepts of religion and how they relate to the arts and what I would call the last few decades of the decline in many of the major art forms, especially pop art. I've interviewed a number of Buddhists, and I've interviewed a Jainist and a few other, a Hindu. There's this concept in the East, whether it's true or not, that the sense of being rather than becoming. And I've never found that particularly satisfactory. I think you need a little bit of both. But I look at the year 1980 as probably the year here in the U.S. at least when most of artistic culture went south. I think the end of the new Hollywood, where you had more personal filmmakers making films. I think pop music declined once we got into new wave and using synthetic music. I think that television reached its peak in the 1970s, and then sort of with the Norman Lear comedies and more sophisticated comedies, then it got dumber. And I could go on in other things, but whether you agree with that or not, that's my posit here. And I think one of the reasons is because a lot of people have started subscribing to the idea that art should be just about being. Hence, we get art which is based upon one's sexuality, one's religion, one's looks, one's social state, one's color, race, etc., rather than taking. I mean, and I'm all for, if you have a black lesbian, atheist as the main character, that's great. But if you're putting forth a story, there has to be something more that frames them, because very few people in real life go around saying, "I'm a black lesbian atheist." I'm me. And I think one of the reasons that art, especially if I stick with literature, I'm the most knowledgeable of, is that there's a lack of fun in a lot of art. I sometimes see. There was a young fellow that sent me a book of poems of his, and they were mediocre, a little bit of talent here or there, but it was all this obsessive. What used to be called confessionalist poetry, this idea that every little fart I take has some deep cosmic meaning, rather than trying to reach out and communicate. Yes, if I'm writing a poem about something, I wrote a poem called the Al Capone Can Zone. That means that Dan Schneider had some minor interest in a dead gangster. I don't have to go beyond that and explain and just go on and on about it. What do you and I ascribe this again to the idea of being that my presence alone is enough to justify anything I want to say, and I'll call it art. Do you think that Eastern viewpoint, whether it's true or just bastardized by the process of coming to the West, has any bearing on this?
Well, I mean, I would distance myself from that view of, you know, I, well, first of all, I guess the same thing is like the Hindu, the South Asian tradition is very different from the East Asian traditions. So, the East Asian is, the mother is China. The South Asian, the mother is India. And although there was some connection between them through the Silk Road, the ideas are very different. Actually, Chinese metaphysics is all about becoming, not about being. The whole framework of the I Ching and then follows that things move from one to the other. They go from yin to yang and then back again. The idea, the Western idea, the Platonic idea of being reality as what's permanent and unchanging is completely foreign to the Chinese view. The I Ching, the name of it's translated as the Book of Changes. And so they have a conception that nothing simply is and remains the same. Everything changes. So that I put to the side. But what's more important, I mean, I think what I understand as the crux of your point, and I think it's actually very American, is just the self-focus and narcissism. The idea that because you're a free individual and you live in a free country that where you're allowed to assert your individuality, it makes you so special that whatever there is about you is worth not simply expressing, but expressing ad infinitum, no matter how boring it is to other people. I didn't. I had my education in the Middle East, in Israel, when it was a socialist country. And there, the idea of spending so much time thinking about yourself, it just was unheard of. The idea was how you contribute, to the whole, how you serve your country and your community. I think I don't know what it is in the United States, but I think it's been happening for a while, maybe even before 1980s. I think there's what was his name, Christopher something Ash, about the narcissistic society. Um, the wonderful thing about the United States and American culture is that you can be an individual, although there are tremendous conformist influences. And in fact, some of this focus on identity is simply conformity. Everyone wants to be an individual, so in some way, they all conform to this model of self-expression. I think, it comes from the good background that we don't have to conform. But I think, it's overdone, and maybe part of the reason is a lack of social ideals or community ideals for us to connect to. If we feel we can't connect to anything bigger than ourselves, then the natural reaction is to make yourself bigger. I think this is actually one of the nice things about religion and about art. If you want to find meaning, instead of making yourself so big, you connect with something huge, like a religious tradition or an artistic tradition. A long time ago, I wrote a book on T.S. Eliot. He had a very important theory of tradition and the impersonal theory of poetry, where to be a great poet is not to assert your individuality alone, it's to assert your connection to the tradition of poetry. And you can't be a good poet without absorbing that tradition and carrying it further. Um, I don't know exactly what it is that created this, I would say, a culture of narcissism or just self focus, but I find it distinctive of the United States as opposed to other cultures where it would be in bad taste to be so confessional. You might write it to yourself and then publish it after you're dead, but to make that your main focus, and actually, I think some people, even in the academy now, they will introduce their paper by that kind of identification, as if, of course, it always helps to know where someone is coming from, but hopefully, if it's an academic paper or a poem, it should work in some way on itself without the justification of who wrote it.
Well, I think that's a product of consumer culture. Consumer culture is all about the self, me, 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 me. Calvin Coolidge said the business of America is business. I mean, that's a pretty damning philosophy if you ever want to hear one. And as regards to what you were saying earlier, it's like every kid with a pink mohawk thinks they're being a rebel from everyone else, and yet they're all just like they'd have no idea.
To pick up on that in a strange way. I mean, to a certain extent, people have also connected consumer culture to religion,
Mm.
because the idea that everyone is a free individual made in the image of God with individual rights. So those rights include, rights to buy, contract rights. And in fact, one of the ways that the great German philosopher, contemporary philosopher Habermas, was hoping that the East Asia would become more westernized was actually through the idea of consumerism and the right to contract,
Mm.
because the right to individual contract implies the right of every human being to be free and to control his or her purchases. And so, that's a very, I guess, post Enlightenment Western idea. Before modernity, there were sumptuary laws, laws about clothes, right? If you were in the tailor, Schneider is a tailor's name
Yeah.
in German. If you were a tailor, you had to wear the tailor suit of your guild. If you were the servant of a particular noble family, you had to wear the livery of that family. The fact that we can choose our clothes and wear what we want is something, a conquest of freedom and liberty that we have in modernity. And in certain areas, that individual expression is very limited. But yeah, certainly consumerism fuels narcissism. I mean, I think
Well,
they go together. and the lack of interest in others, because then what's important is what you buy. And yeah, but what you buy then, this is just the paradox of conformism that you alluded to with the pink mohawk, is
Yeah.
that you define your distinctive identity by what you buy, but what you buy depends on what's trending. So you follow the trends, and unfortunately, I think political leaders more and more, instead of showing leadership, are simply following trends.
Well, yeah, there's a peculiar strain of Christian fundamentalism here in the U.S. where people like a Joel Osteen, who has this TV program, will say, "Jesus wants you to have that BMW," you know.
Yeah, well, Max Weber, the famous Berlin German sociologist, connected the rise of capitalism with the Protestant work ethic,
Mm.
about working hard to make more money, and working hard as part of a religious discipline of self-improvement. It just
But
got.
the difference, and I come from a Lutheran background. My Pastor Martin Stagey, I still remember his name from 50 years ago. You were to work hard and to make money, but for the good of all, not just for your own enrichment.
That's right.
And people forget that last part.
No, no, it's true. It's true. It's true because in his time, um, Germany was a much more everywhere. It was more community
Mm.
oriented. Selfishness was like greed. It was like a sin.
Yeah.
And so, I don't want to go into it, but the social structures were different. Families were multi-generational things. One thing that capitalism and the economy has done, and it's also much more true in a big country like America, is it's destabilized the social communities because people move because of work. In more traditional societies, you lived in the same place where your father and your grandfather or your mother and your grandmother lived, but with the development of industry and commerce, so you belong to a firm and they move you where they want to. And actually, in Japan, that's that's been responsible for a demographic disaster, because what happens is in the old days the grandmother could take care of the grandchildren while both parents worked. But when the son was sent to work in a different company, it, sent to a different place to work for the company that was remote from his original place, and his wife had a baby, there was no one to come and take care of the baby. And it was considered, still is considered, wrong to have a full time nanny or babysitter.
Mm.
And so the women, it meant the end of their independent life to have children. And so the birth rate in Japan has plummeted because it's like suicide for a forward thinking, active woman to have children. Either she has to have a full time nanny and then be looked on as inadequate mother, or just be condemned to be at home all the time with the child.
So, Richard, let me bring this back to tying religion and art together here. Um, One of the things that I've noticed in the arts, there's the obvious kind of petty jealousy, especially between when you have artists of quality bickering about this or that. You should be in this ism or that ism. But I ascribe it to what I've called the divine inspiration fallacy. I think there's this belief amongst many creative people that their creativity somehow lies out there in the ether, and that if I pluck down a great sonnet or a great symphony, someone else is not going to have that mojo that's in the universe. And this goes back to the idea, even too, of the demiurge. And I think that's a pretty bad way to view creativity. And I think it has a lot to do with, if not religion per se, sort of a quasi-religious approach to art. What is your take on the idea of the demiurge and how it affects artists?
Well, no, I think you're right. That's an example that I gave earlier about genius. The idea of genius as some kind of supernatural force that a particular individual has.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to the idea of divine election. Like Moses was chosen to be God's spokesperson, and so Amadeus was chosen as God's gift to the world of music. So yeah, I think there are dangers there. I mean, I think one of the important points is to see, and this is something that the great American thinker and individualist Emerson saw, is that genius is always more than a personal force. You know, his idea was that okay, you're selected, but it doesn't give you any special privilege. It just means that things came together in a certain way that you were able to get this idea.
Mm-hmm.
And you could get this idea because you are at the end of a certain tradition, because you had certain experiences. It's not like you in your personal property, it's you belonging to a certain context and tradition. I mean, this is what T.S. Eliot was talking about when he talked about the impersonal theory of poetry, is that the poetic genius doesn't create from his own inner, purely inner possessions. He or she creates from the contextual resources that he's been fortunate enough to be situated in, and he is simply the medium of those kind of forces. Now, you can understand that religiously in the way that people would talk about the muses, and the poet would be possessed by the muses. That was the original Greek theory of creation and poetry. Or you can understand it sociologically, like Pierre Bourdieu, and say that every genius is the product of all sorts of social, historical contexts and facts, and that person is simply in the right place at the right time to absorb those influences and be able to express them. So, in other words, there's singularity there, but it's not only the person, it's the environment. And actually, there's a very beautiful haiku about that, about the cherry tree, where the poem goes, the beautiful blossoms you see, they didn't come in, they didn't come from the inner nature of the cherry tree. They depend on the heaven and the sun and the sky, because that's where they unfold. So there are ways of understanding the singularity of creativity without having a narcissistic, self-important aspect to it.
Well, I think people need to get away from the idea of people being geniuses, but people can have a genius. For example, Mozart's a good example. He had a genius for music, but in every other way, he was a man child, if we're to believe historical records. Albert Einstein was great in math and physics, but if you read his views on politics or art or whatnot, they are sub-pedestrian at best. So let me just end here by asking then, what are you working on any books in the future? What will the near future bring in terms of your own output?
Well, what I should mention actually is a book that's kind of connected with this topic. It's a book that I published with Cambridge University Press in 2021. It's called Ars Erotica, and it's about sex and some aesthetics in the classical arts of love. And actually, although the book's title is Ars Erotica and the subtitle has sex in it, it's as much about religion as it is about sexuality,
Mm.
because that's another place where religion has a very powerful imprint. And even in the aesthetic and artistic dimensions of lovemaking, because I treat both Western and Asian theories of love and lovemaking, religion helps determine the aesthetic and sets the limits of what's possible and not possible.
Well, I will link to your university page as well as to a link to the essay in question. Thank you, Richard Schusterman, for spending an hour speaking with me.
Okay, thank you, Dan, and good luck with your future interviews and life.